Welcome back. International adoption is a relatively recent phenomenon. While some countries have clear guidelines for adopting, others have no rules in place. Well, one country which does have strong guidelines is China. It recently tightened its rules. One of the biggest changes there is that single parents are no longer able to adopt out of China. Parents must be between the ages of 30 and 50, have been married for at least 2 years, and both must have completed secondary school. Family income must be derived from at least one parent having a stable job, and this income must exceed $10,000 per family member, and the net worth must exceed $80,000. Well, homosexual couples are not permitted to adopt. Parents considered to be obese are not eligible, nor are those on antidepressant medication. Well, once again, we're joined by our guests in London, Louise Melville, a care advisor for the charity Save the Children. In Chicago, Tom DeFilippo, Chief Executive of the Joint Council on International Children's Services. And we're also joined now on the phone from Gloucestershire, England, by adoptive parent Henry Peevers. He adopted 2 daughters, Lucy and Amy, from China. If I could start with you, Henry. We were talking earlier in part 1 about the need for more restrictions and that the whole adoption process is too loose. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't, not particularly where the English case is concerned. In Great Britain, the rules and regulations that the local social authorities have are very, very tight. Checks and rechecks are meticulous by their nature, which is why the whole process in first adopting Amy was the first one to come to England, took just shy of 3 years from start to finish. So I understand also now that China is putting further restrictions, but they're just narrowing some of the parameters. Most of those restrictions were in place when Claire and I applied, hence the process of 3 years. Partly because China is strict in itself, but also because this country is also strict in the way it vets and processes applications.
All right, let's go over to Tom. Some may argue, Tom, that whatever rules, whatever regulations are brought out, how easy is it going to be for any authorities to police them, to clamp down on them, if parents themselves, in some cases, are the ones selling the kids?
That's a difficult question. I think that if I could just jump to the comments of your guest for just 1 second, I do think that the regulations from the adoptive parent's perspective are exceptionally well done, both in the UK, France, United States. The requirements are very, very tight, and we don't have any concerns about the families that the children are going into. But as you mentioned, the interface between the social service agencies and the birth parents is where some of the corruption takes place.
That's the
birth
gap.
Parents are sometimes induced. Yep, that's the gap. If we can somehow, in some countries, it's already been addressed. In places like Ethiopia, we're assisting the government now in trying to set up systems and protocols so that there's legitimate interface between the social service agencies and the birth parents.
All right, Luis, Tom was earlier talking about the problem of definitions. How easy is it going to be to distinguish between child trafficking and legitimate adoption?
It is difficult, particularly when there may be adoption papers with the original parent's signature. And we have many stories of parents being forced to sign against their will. We have stories coming in from India, for example, of children being kidnapped. So it may well be that, again, the signatures have been forged. Again, in Liberia, that we have reports of children being placed in orphanages to be inter-country adopted without the consent of their parents.
All right, well, it's not only those sort of rules, there's also conventions and rules against improper financial gain being made in an adoption process. I'd like to ask Henry how he feels about that. Examples have been given where people trying to adopt may be asked for, if not money, but perhaps medical supplies, clothing for the adoption orphanages or agencies. How do you feel about that as someone who's gone through that process?
It's never stated and put down in a list that this is what you're required to do. But I think that what does happen, there are many societies in this country which are support groups for people who adopt from China, and there are distinct encouragements that when you go there to take the things that you feel that any orphanage would need. That's not money, that goes in the form of toys and blankets and things like that. But
so is that okay, or is that a bribe, a payment?
I feel perfectly fine with that, because we went to China originally for two reasons. First of all, in all brutal truth, the queue was shortest. And secondly, because we knew by reputation the Chinese authorities and the orphanages were by and large very strictly run and if you like the word, purely run. And it certainly was the case when I went out there. Both for Amy and Lucy, we managed to get permission to go and see their orphanages, and actually had a lunch with the orphanage directors with the aid of interpreters. We were able to ask all sorts of far-reaching questions, and all of them were answered satisfactorily. And you could see, simply by going to the orphanages and watching the care workers there at work, what caring people they were, and how well, with a limited budget, which you could also detect that undercurrent, how well they were working.
Right.
But certainly the concept of bribery, no, that doesn't come into it.
All right, I want to throw this interesting piece of information I gathered here to Tom in Chicago. Every time Madonna or Angelina Jolie appear in the headlines, the volunteer organization Intercountry Adoption Center, or IAC, registers a 25% rise in calls to its helpline. You think that's a good thing? Is that helpful?
Certainly. Absolutely. Anything that brings attention to children in need and brings additional aid into that region or that country, how can that not be a good thing?
Some would argue that it's growing too fast, too quickly. There isn't enough infrastructure in place in the supplier end, so to put, as it's described, supplier countries to deal with it in a way that avoids corruption.
We would agree with that. For instance, in Vietnam, in Ethiopia, in Liberia, that Louise mentioned earlier, the percentage growths are huge. The raw numbers are small. In Liberia, a 500% increase may only be 60 children. However, despite that, in places like Ethiopia or Vietnam, you don't want just unlimited access to children that are in orphanages. You want a managed system, managed growth. We don't want it to just suddenly explode. That opens up all kinds of avenues for corruption. And we call for regulations to be in place in these countries.
All right, well, while talking of regulations, Luis, is the Hague Convention mistaken for relying on supplier states to regulate their own adoption practices? I mean, doesn't impoverished developing country really have any incentive to say a child's best interest, yes, really does lie in being raised at home and not adopted abroad when they're suffering from lack of resources, infrastructure?
Going back to an earlier point, I'd like to stress that the vast majority of children in orphanages globally are not orphans. They have one or both parents alive who frequently, because of poverty, are forced to give up their children. We at Save the Children would strongly say that poverty is never a good enough reason for children to be forced into care, and instead those families should be supported to care for their own children.
Well, isn't that a sign of the situation, though, Louise, if at the end of the day, despite the fact that they still have a parent, some of them are still being pushed into adoption abroad? Doesn't that say something about the corruption in the home countries?
Well, I think it says more about a lack of investment in basic services. We know, for example, to support a family or a community to care for children is many, many times less expensive than running an institution. And that's where resources should go. International adoption is not a solution to orphans. The solution is helping relatives and developing national adoption, for example, fostering services within countries, rather than allowing children to be sold to wealthy families in the West.
All right, Tom, can developing countries do it on their own, or does the developed world have some responsibility to beef up the welfare systems in the supplier countries?
Well, I'm having some difficulties with this conversation and some of the terms that are being thrown around, such as supplier countries, selling children. It costs $20,000 to buy a child. These are terms that I think show a predisposition against permanency planning for children.
All right, let's put the terminology aside though for a second. Let's just talk about who needs to do what in terms of helping the welfare systems in countries where children are adopted from.
Well, obviously the country where the child resides, that child's country has the primary responsibility for the child's overall well-being. When that's not possible or it isn't happening, either way, I think the international development community has a responsibility to come in and assist with the development of a full range of child welfare programs, everything from intervention all the way through to independent living.
All right, we'll have to leave the discussion there. We are running out of time. Tom DiFilippo from the Joint Council on International Children's Services, Louise Melville from Save the Children, and Henry Peevers, an adoptive parent. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, the viewer, so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.